Hello everyone, this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to take a look at the claims made by many on the X platform that the ancient Iranians were white or Nordic Europeans. And again, I must emphasize that these individuals believe that the ancient Iranians were Nordic Europeans, not just Europeans but of Northern European descent. I will utilize the latest available genetic data to refute these claims, and what you will see is that modern day Iranians are primarily of indigenous Iranian farmer descent with only minimal ancestry from a European, from a South Asian, as well as from an Arabian source. In terms of scope, these samples go all the way back to the Neolithic and all the way up until the present day, including Copper Age as well as Bronze and Iron Age Iranian samples, and also early modern and modern samples. Now, without further ado, I'd like to take a look at these claims made on the X platform by many deluded individuals. Up first, we have this now deleted post by someone who goes by the name of Crimes Against Humanity. As you can see, he posted, friendly reminder that Iranians were basically white before the Arabs came and raped everyone, and you can also see an image of a proto-Iranic Sintashta individual with very Nordic features. Thus, this individual is claiming that the ancient Iranians were Nordic until the Arab conquest of Iran. This is a very ridiculous claim made by this individual. Now here is an excellent Iranian reply to this ridiculous claim, and basically what Shahram said was, this has to be the most cringe talking point Jason Raza Giordani fans and neo-pagan Europeans try to make up, and then he just stated how there's been a great degree of genetic continuity in Iran for 10,000 years, and Iranians, even the ones with recessive features such as fair skin and fair hair, are still phenotypically very close to other Iranians and not really northwestern or eastern Europeans. And to conclude, Shahram said, we are not white, brown, people of color, or any of these modernist terms. We are Iranians whom are a physical and spiritual race. Moving on, someone who goes by the name of The Commander wrote, Iranians aren't white. 98% of your genetics is Arab and Indian. Go be brown somewhere else. Now, this is a very fallacious claim to make, and as my genetic analysis in the past has proven, this is not at all the case. And I actually made a video a long time ago refuting this claim, and that video has been attached to the top right, so you can watch it whenever you get a chance to. The commander also posted, lol, none of the genetics has been disproven. In fact, dozens of studies confirm the exact same PCA results I just posted. Iranians are brown Middle Eastern and never track inside the white European race. You're brown. Now, Iranians are not white Europeans. What they are is an indigenous population to West Asia with very little ties to the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia. And my genetic analysis will refute the lunacy of this individual. Now here is another interesting post, and it's by an individual who goes by the name Nouri, and what they basically said was, friendly reminder that Iranians were basically white before the Arabs came and raped everyone. Again, this is another ridiculous post which is not grounded in any reality. Now, among all of these lies and misinformation in white nationalist circles, there is one individual by the name of Owen McCormick who made a very interesting post. As you can see, Owen posted, Sintashta were white and more Aryan than anyone alive today, but they were not Iranians. They were common ancestors of all Indo-Iranians, and by the time their descendants arrived in Iran, they were already half-castes. They mixed themselves into oblivion. Arab rape is irrelevant. I think this is a post that is much more grounded in reality compared to the ones I've previously shared here. And then Owen also posted, good timing from Ratam, the half-castes in question. And from Ratam's post, you can see an individual who is very much of an Iranian phenotype with ancestry from the steppe. As you can see, these Western Aryans were on average 49% steppe or Andronovo, 40% BMAC, and 11% Kumse. The Andronovo ancestry is steppe European, the BMAC ancestry is Iranian farmer, and the Kumse component is some sort of West Siberian ancestry. Moving on, here is yet another interesting post, and this is also from a European, and what you can see, what this individual wrote is that no, the Sintashta were white Aryan but later emigrated to the Iranian plateau where they mixed with the indigenous people, creating what we understand today as Iranians. So Iranians were never white, they were mixed from the beginning, even before the contact with Arabs. Now, while I agree with this post, I just like to add that the Andronovo population mixed in Central Asia with the BMAC farmers before migrating to Iran, though, so they already had that sort of ancestry even before they arrived in the Iranian plateau. That is essentially it for the first phase of this analysis. Up next, I will be providing genetic evidence from Gene Tiger's database, which is ultimately derived from Harvard's genetic dataset. Gene Tiger's analysis is public, and I've included a link to that in the description. Before I begin this analysis, I just like to say that back in 2017, I made a video utilizing Gene Tiger's old dataset, and this most updated one is much better and much more accurate and actually addresses the issues I had with it back then. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin the genetic analysis. Here is the legend for Gene Tiger's autosomal breakdowns. In terms of ancient sites, these samples are from Western Iran, from the site of Ganjdara primarily, though there is a single late Neolithic sample from Sagabi as well. And if you're interested in learning more about these sites, you can email me at irantalk95@gmail.com. But if not, you can watch a video I made a while ago on the sites of Iran from where these samples were taken from, and it's been linked to the top right here. Though for the most part, the majority of these samples are from Western Iran, with the exception of a few which I will discuss later, and those are from more recent studies. With these Neolithic Iranian samples, you can see that they're mostly of Northern Middle Eastern descent, which is very interesting, and only have minimal South Asian, European, and Sub-Saharan African ancestry, with tiny amounts of Australoid and East Asian ancestry as well. Thus, even the oldest Iranian samples are primarily of indigenous West Asian or Middle Eastern descent. Here are more Neolithic samples from around the same time frame, also from Western Iran, and again you can see that they're mostly of indigenous West Asian descent, primarily Northern Middle Eastern, with only minimal non-Northern Middle Eastern ancestry, and the majority of that comes from South Asia and Europe. Thus, once again, the Neolithic Iranians seem to be fairly uniform genetically. Now, more than 1,000 years later, you had another Neolithic culture develop, and this was around the site of Haji Firuz in northwestern Iran. And again, it is descended from the northern Middle Eastern cluster. Nonetheless, it does have a bit more early European farmer ancestry, tilting it a bit towards southern Europe, nonetheless maintaining that older Neolithic Iranian ancestry. This admixture from the late Neolithic was maintained through the Chalcolithic, as you can see with these Sagabi samples. Nonetheless, there was an uptick in the northern Middle Eastern ancestry as well as Natufian or southern Middle Eastern related ancestry, and minor amounts of South Asian related Caucasian Vadoid ancestry. Now, what's interesting to note is that the Chalcolithic ancestry found in northwestern and western Iran was a bit distinct of that found in eastern and northeastern Iran. And as evidence for this, you can see from a few thousand years after the previous Sagabi culture in northwestern Iran, there was another culture known as the Tepe-Hisar culture, and this developed in northeastern Iran in the province of Semnan, and you can see that the majority of its ancestry is derived from the northern Middle Eastern cluster. What's more is that the European ancestry is much lower than is found in the Sagabi site, and there is also a bit more South Asian ancestry, which is interesting. Nonetheless, again, the overwhelming ancestral component here is the northern Middle Eastern component. Now, after the Chalcolithic, we had the development of various Bronze Age cultures across the ancient Near East and Southern Europe, and one of these cultures was the Shah Tepe culture, which was located in Hyrcania in northeastern Iran. Well, what was historically known as Hyrcania. Once again, you can see a great degree of genetic continuity and stability since the Neolithic, as the largest component found in these Shah Tepe samples is the northern Middle Eastern component, followed by the European component, and finally minimal amounts of ancestry derived from a South Asian Vadoid component. Before I proceed, I just like to state that the European component that's found in the samples discussed so far is the early European farmer component or the Anatolia Neolithic farmer component, and not the Nordic or Northern European steppe component. Moving on, here are the breakdowns for the last of the Bronze Age Iranian cultures, and this sample set is from Shakri-Sokhta in southeastern Iran, which was a part of the Helmand culture and probably closely related to the Giraft culture. As you can see, This culture was primarily derived from northern Middle Eastern populations with only minimal ancestry from a European and a South Asian source. Though nonetheless, you can see that the South Asian ancestry is a bit elevated here, but overall, they're still mostly of indigenous West Asian descent, which is quite interesting. Thus, what has been proven is that the pre-Aryan population of Iran was primarily a Middle Eastern population with only minimal Mediterranean European ancestry and also minor amounts of Southern Middle Eastern as well as ancestry deriving from a Wadoid Caucasian South Asian hybrid. These ancestral proportions remain stable through the Bronze Age, especially the Mid-Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age, as you can see with these two samples from northwestern Iran from the site of Tepe Hasanlu. Once again, the results for these two samples suggest that they were primarily a two-way admixture between Europeans, particularly early European farmers, and the native Iranian farmers with only minimal ancestry from other European sources as well as ancestry from southern Middle Eastern and South Asian sources. Thus, these results prove an indigenous northern Middle Eastern ancestral origin point for the pre-Aryan population of Iran from the Neolithic up to the Bronze Age. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age saw an influx of ancestry from the Andronovo horizon, and this was European ancestry. Nonetheless, it did not form the majority of the component of the ancient Iranian population within the plateau of Iran at any specific time. And the reason for this is quite simple and well illustrated by this map, which was created by my good friend Son of Manu. As you can see, the Nordic Andronovo culture was bordered to the south by the Bimak culture, and this was made up of indigenous Iranian farmers. And you can also see the Yaz culture highlighted there as well, and this was the result of this genetic and cultural synthesis between these two cultures. Thus, the Aryans who migrated to Iran were a product of the indigenous Bimak farmers and the incoming Proto-Indo-Iranians. Here are the admixture results for the Andronovo population from Russia as well as from Kazakhstan, and you can see that they're mostly of European descent, reflected here by all the blue components with minimal ancestry deriving from a northern Middle Eastern source, and this is probably from Caucasian hunter-gatherers and not directly from Iran. And this Andronovo population admixed with the indigenous Iranian farmers who were primarily of northern Middle Eastern descent, as you can see here, but they also had minor amounts of South Asian as well as European ancestry. Thus, the farmers of the Bimak culture were indeed an indigenous Iranian population, much like that of Chalcolithic and Neolithic Iran. And here are the results associated with the Yaz culture from Iron Age Turkmenistan, and you can see that despite being mostly of European descent, nonetheless these Yaz Aryans had significant northern Middle Eastern ancestry as well as minor amounts of South Asian ancestry, highlighting that they were an admixed population between the Indo-European steppe peoples and the indigenous population of the Bimak culture as mentioned. These Yaz Aryans then migrated to the Iranian plateau and settled in southern as well as northwestern Iran, for the most part forming the Persian and the Median cultures. Despite this, it should be mentioned that there were other Iranic cultures in the Iranian plateau. Nonetheless, the Persians and the Medians are the two most notable and the two most influential in Iranian history. While we don't have any samples from Median sites as well as Persian sites in northwestern and southern Iran respectively, we nonetheless have samples from the sites of Tepe Hasanlu as well as Dinka Tepe and also Haji Firuz Tepe, and I will be taking a look at those Iron Age samples here next. Up first, here are the results for the samples from the site of Tepe Hasanlu, and you can see that they're primarily of two-way descent between European ancestry and indigenous northern Middle Eastern ancestry with minor amounts of southern Middle Eastern ancestry as well as South Asian ancestry. The South Asian ancestry here is of course reflected by the emerald color, so in case you didn't know, the Caucasoid-Wadoid hybrid population is a South Asian population. And what's also worth mentioning here is that these samples are from around the time the Medians settled in northwestern Iran. So while most of them likely do not have any Median ancestry, some of them could indeed be Medians. Nonetheless, we are not sure, as most of them are associated with the Western grey ware phenomenon. In this regard, it is possible that they received their European ancestry from a migration through the Caucasus, though nonetheless this is unlikely, and I reckon that these samples do harbor some Median ancestry. Moving on, here are the samples from the site of Dinka Tepe in northwestern Iran, and once again you can see that they're from the same time period and also that they primarily descend from a northern Middle Eastern source, even more so than the Hassanlu samples, with minor amounts of ancestry from a southern Middle Eastern as well as South Asian source and also a bit of European ancestry as well. And once again, I reckon that these samples are partially descended from the Medians, as they have minor amounts of ancestry deriving from a South Asian source which made its way to Iran indirectly from the BMAC culture. And as further evidence for this, you can see that these other Dinka Tepe samples, which date to a bit before the previous Dinka Tepe samples, you can see that these ones have no South Asian related ancestry and have less northern Middle Eastern ancestry with a bit more southern Middle Eastern ancestry. So I reckon that these were the natives, and the other later development in the Western grave area was influenced by the Median culture, hence why they had a bit of South Asian as well as BMAC ancestry in comparison to these samples. And there's also another Iron Age sample from Haji Fruz, which again is a site in northwestern Iran, and once again you can see that they're mostly of northern Middle Eastern descent with minimal ancestry deriving from a southern Middle Eastern as well as a South Asian source. Though nonetheless, again you can see with these samples they tend to have a bit of South Asian ancestry, and that leads me to believe that this is BMAC related admixture. Thus, these results for Iron Age Iranians proves that they were never white or Europeans genetically and were primarily descended from an indigenous northern Middle Eastern source with also tiny amounts of southern Middle Eastern as well as South Asian ancestry, and these components were already present in the Iranian genome during the Iron Age, and as you will see, they're also found at very low frequencies in modern day Iranians, which means that once I will present the modern day Iranian results, there is around 90% genetic continuity in contemporary Iranians. And this continuity was maintained through the early modern period, as you can see with this Ganj Dara historic sample from 1561, that again the primary descent is from a northern Middle Eastern source with only minimal ancestry from a southern Middle Eastern, South Asian as well as non-Mediterranean European sources. What this means is that Iranian genetic continuity has remained fairly stable since the past 2000 to 2500 years, dating all the way back to the Iron Age. And I state this fact before even presenting the results for contemporary Iranians, as they too harbor a great degree of genetic stability. And as evidence for this, I will begin by taking a look at the genetic origins of contemporary Iranian Zoroastrians. And as you can see, here are their results, and they are primarily of northern Middle Eastern descent with some Mediterranean European ancestry and only minimal amounts of southern Middle Eastern and South Asian ancestry, and also a few of them have tiny amounts of East Asian ancestry as well. The only difference between today's Zoroastrians and the previous samples taken a look at is that they have a bit more southern Middle Eastern as well as a bit more South Asian ancestry. Nonetheless, aside from that, they are around 90% genetically contiguous, which is quite interesting. Here are the results for contemporary Iranians that were originally labeled as Iran Fars, but nonetheless I think this is just referring that they're Persian speakers, that these samples have been proven to be from across Iran, from Qom, from Yazd, as well as Shiraz and other cities. And if you want the correct labels for these samples, you can email me at irantalk95@gmail.com. The results for these samples suggest that they're primarily of ancient Iron Age Iranian descent, which is made up of the northern Middle Eastern as well as the Mediterranean European component with minor amounts of northern European ancestry and also minor amounts of South Asian and southern Middle Eastern ancestry. Though with these samples you can see an uptick in the last two of these ancestries, they're nonetheless very minimal. Thus, with this particular Iranian dataset, you can see significant continuity, and this refutes the so-called Arab miscegenation myth, as well as the notion that radical genetic changes were brought about by the Turco-Mongol invasions of Iran. Moving on, here is yet another Iranian dataset, and once again you can see with this one that the ancestral components are very similar to the Iron Age Iranians, which is quite interesting. Though nonetheless, again you can see a bit more South Asian ancestry here and a bit more Southern Middle Eastern ancestry as well. Moving on, here are more samples from this exact same dataset, just that have been differently labeled, and you can see minimal Southern Middle Eastern and South Asian ancestry and up to 90% ancestry from the Iron Age Iranians, which is very interesting. Thus, once again, these results prove that contemporary Iranians have minimal foreign ancestry and are largely genetically contiguous. What's more is that sub-Saharan African ancestry in Iranians is largely absent, and what this means is that they were not significantly impacted by the Islamic slave trade. Before I conclude, I'd just like to take a look at the genetic origins of the Kurds as well as the Yazidis. I want to take a look at these two populations because there is a lot of misinformation about them, such as this post which features two Kurdish children with blonde hair and blue eyes. Nonetheless, you can see that in terms of their phenotype, they have a very Iranian facial structure. And the results I present will refute the false notion that the Kurds and Yazidis are somehow Nordic remnants living within the Middle East. Here are the results for Iraqi Kurds, and you can see that they're primarily of northern Middle Eastern and Mediterranean European descent with only minimal southern Middle Eastern and South Asian as well as East Asian ancestries. Thus, these results prove that the Kurds of today are very close genetically to other Iranians with only slightly less ancestry from a South Asian source. Finally, here are the results for the Yazidis, and you can see that genetically they're very close to other Kurdish populations as well as other Iranians. I say this because the majority of their ancestry is derived from a northern Middle Eastern as well as a Mediterranean source with only minimal ancestry from a southern Middle Eastern and South Asian as well as East Asian sources. Thus, what these results prove is that the Yazidis are not a Nordic remnant living within the Middle East, but rather are an indigenous Middle Eastern population. To conclude, the presented genetic analysis refuted the claims made by many white nationalists that the Iranians were a Nordic population up until the Arab invasion, and by the time of Islam they were largely replaced by the Arabs as well as Turco-Mongols, whereas the reality is that this could not be further from the truth. In fact, the Iranians of today are very close to the Iron Age and early modern Iranians, and that's quite interesting, and it goes to show that there is indeed around 80 to 90% genetic continuity amongst the majority of Iran's population today. It is also worth mentioning that the Aryans who migrated to Iran migrated from Central Asia from the environs of the Yaz culture and were already admixed by the time they reached Iran, as they acculturated the indigenous Bimak population which was derived from Iranian farmers. Thus, in contrast to the claims made by white nationalists, the ancient Iranians were not Nordic Europeans and the modern Iranians are indeed their true and direct descendants. That is it for this video. Thanks for watching and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.